After a brief look at Keats's notion of negative capability and how it advocates a more intuitive, mystical encounter with truth, we shall go on to analyze closely Percy Bysshe Shelley's A Defense of Poetry. Keats's notion of negative capability offers, I think, a contrast to Coleridgean theory, and that's why I place it here. The phrase negative capability actually appears briefly and enigmatically in only one letter of Keats. Sort of like primary and secondary imagination. There's only a tiny bit about it, and it's up to us to figure out what he meant. I think these people like to do it just to get us talking about them or something. But anyway, according to Keats, this is what he does tell us. Poets like Shakespeare who possess negative capability are, quote, capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. That is to say, they are able to rest in the midst of mysteries and paradoxes without needing to reach after fixed answers or resolutions. Negative capability means that we don't always have to find a simple answer and solve all the riddles. We can just rest there and say, it's okay. It's a paradox, but I'm just going to accept it and sort of rest in it. Remember I told you that romantic theory tends to be more feminine than masculine? I find in general that women have more negative capability. Men tend to think, I want an answer, I want a philosophical answer, and that's it. I want a solution. Whereas women seem to be able to accept things more as they are and sort of live in that. Just accept it. And again, that's a quality of, Keats thinks that's a quality that a poet should have. The ability to just accept the paradoxes as they are. Another way to put it, poets who have negative capability are able, both philosophically and aesthetically, to suspend their powers of judgment and reason and receive passively. Negative capability is a passive kind of thing rather than an active thing, because you suspend, kind of like willing suspension of disbelief in a different way. You suspend all of your ideas and your need for answers, and you just receive passively what's going on. Indeed, asserts Keats in a related letter, such poets take such direct joy in the powers of the imagination that they receive as much delight in conceiving an Iago as an Imogen. Now, you all know who Iago is. That's the great villain of Othello, one of the greatest villains in Shakespeare. Imogen, less people know that. She's from a lesser-known play called Cymbeline by Shakespeare, and she is the perfect, virtuous heroine. To put it in terms we would understand, it's as if he were to say he takes as much delight in conceiving an Iago as a Desdemona. And I wish he just said that, because Desdemona rings more bells. Now, what does he mean by that? What he's saying is that Shakespeare, because he had negative capability, took as much delight in creating an evil character as a good and virtuous character. The reason is because for Keats, poetry is something that is above the moral. There is just a joy in creativity itself that surpasses whether it's an evil character or a good character. That's negative capability. Now, Keats says, Coleridge, on the other hand, could not remain content with half knowledge. He had to solve the mystery and resolve the paradox. That's the philosophical side of Coleridge. He couldn't accept the mystery. He had to solve it. Coleridge was not content merely to receive passively. To him, that was slothful. He sought, rather, an active, shaping imagination. The funny thing about Coleridge was he often fell into periods of sloth, but he hated himself when he did it. Poor Coleridge was riddled with guilt, not a very happy man. He felt that whenever he wasn't working, he was almost, in a sense, sinning. What we would call a Protestant work ethic. Coleridge had that almost too strongly. It made him very, very unhappy and very, very guilty at times. That's one of the reasons he took that opium, to escape from that guilt. Now, another reason for this difference is maybe religion. Again, unlike the heterodox Keats, who worshipped the spirit of great art. If Keats had a religion, it was what we might call neo-paganism. He was a pagan in the highest sense. He worshipped art. And that's different from Coleridge. Remember I told you he was the only Orthodox Christian? Coleridge worshipped a God who was the embodiment of the concrete universal, a God who reveals himself and solves the mystery and embodies himself. So maybe that's why he didn't favor negative capability. Keats, on the other hand, I would say that Keats was almost postmodern in his refusal to judge or freeze truth. He could just accept it and leave it there and not come up with answers. That's almost a modern thing, and I'll mention that when we get to modernism and postmodernism in our final unit. Coleridge, on the other hand, as a Christian, had a more traditional view of art as revelation. You see, for Coleridge, art finally has to give us insight into the truth, if you want to say. Coleridge wants to use poetry to get to truth. That's that philosophical, sort of metaphysical side of him. Keats, again, is just willing to rest in those paradoxes and just accept it. So I think maybe that's one of the reasons for the difference. Now, I just want to say something that might confuse you. I said this was like the willing suspension of disbelief. Well, that's a Coleridgean idea. I think the reason that there's a difference, because they're very similar. The willing suspension of disbelief is a kind of negative capability, but I would argue the willing suspension of disbelief is something that the audience is supposed to have, not the poet. Negative capability is something the poet has. So that perhaps is a way to resolve that paradox, why Keats and Coleridge seem to be saying the same thing and yet are different. All right, now let's turn to Shelley. I would say that Shelley combines the philosophical rigor of Coleridge with the spirit of Keats. And so let's move on to Shelley now. In his famous defense of poetry, Shelley gathers together all the key romantic theories. Like Sidney's apology for poetry, the defense of poetry is a great synthetic work. Not a whole lot of originality in terms of the ideas themselves, but it is original because the synthesis is original. And I'll tell you, if you want to capture the joy and spirit of literary theory, read this beautiful defense of poetry, which is almost like poetry at times. It's written in prose, but it almost has the beauty of poetry at times. Now, in the defense of poetry, in the beginning of it, Shelley treats fully the romantic privileging of imagination over reason. Remember I told you they privilege imagination over reason? Shelley puts it in almost a philosophical disputation in the beginning. He makes a contrast. Shelley says, in the age of reason, theorists celebrated analysis for its ability to study, to calculate, and to discern the differences between things. See, the 18th century, the age of reason, scientific-minded people like to break things down, like Aristotle, put them in little packages. That's analysis. Shelley, of course, is a romantic. He privileges, indeed champions synthesis for its ability to shape and color, to perceive value, and to discover and even create similitude. Shelley's one of those people who handles Plato by turning poetry into the highest kind of philosophy. Now, I want to tell you something that I always tell my students. They don't always believe it. But I say that Shelley and the Romantics pre-understood or were prophetic of science, of Einsteinian science. Why? Okay. Many of you know that the atom bomb was what we call a fission bomb. And the way a fission bomb works is that it splits the atom, and that causes the explosion. All right, nowadays, instead of using fission bombs, we have since invented what is called the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb is a fusion bomb. It works by fusing the core of the atom. Now, a fusion bomb is not just a little bit more powerful than an atom bomb. It's like 100 times more powerful than a fission bomb. In fact, it takes a fission bomb to set off a fusion bomb. Now, let's think about it intuitively. Wouldn't you think that splitting an atom would cause more power than... Actually, I would think splitting an atom wouldn't do anything. But anyway, just think about it. If splitting an atom, you would think that would cause more power than fusing it together. But the Romantics understood that fusion is more powerful than fission. Synthesis is more powerful than analysis. So they understood physics long beforehand. And think about it. To me, love is the most powerful thing in the universe. And what is love but the ultimate synthesis? Again, the marriage, the love of two into one. So Shelley, again, and I mean this funny but also seriously, understood physics long before it came about in our modern age. Another thing he does, I'm talking about handling Plato, I love this. In a wonderful inversion of Plato, Shelley actually asserts that reason is to imagination and analysis is to synthesis as the shadow is to the substance. What is he saying here? In other words, he's saying synthesis is closer to the forms. Analysis is just a shadow or an imitation. That not only turns Plato on his head, that turns the whole 18th century age of enlightenment and reason on its head. Another thing Shelley says about synthesis and poetry, he says poetry is really the most real. Synthetic poetry is much more real than, let's say, analytic philosophy or analytic science, because poetry comes closest to the infinite. Science and reason, those are passing, temporary things with no integral unity. Again, let me tell you the example I use in my class. All right, the way I put it, I get so tired of hearing scientific people say that if you want real truth, eternal truth, you've got to turn to science. Don't turn to the humanities. There's no truth there. Now let's think about it. What are they thinking about? Science completely overturns itself every 50 years, sometimes faster nowadays, so that scientists today look back 100 years ago and laugh at those scientists and at their theories as being ridiculous. Now, I don't know how you define truth, but to me, truth means eternal. It keeps being true. Well, science is always changing. That's not truth to me. What truth is to me is the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey is just as true today as it was over 2,500 years ago when it was written. I mean, if you want to talk about truth with a capital T, to me, you look at the great poetry of the Western world. That's the stuff that hasn't changed. That's the stuff that touches on the infinite. You can hear I'm a little bit on a soapbox here, but again, the humanities need a lot of defense these days. Again, and I get this from Shelley, and this is why I love Shelley's defense of poetry. He tells us, again, poetry is what is everlasting. Shelley has this wonderful phrase that I love. He says, poetry redeems from decay the visitations of the divinity in man. Yet that divine, eternal spark that we always want to grab onto, poetry grabs onto it, holds onto it, embodies it, incarnates it, and so it's there forever. That's similar to Hegel's idea of poetry as a cultural warehouse. All right. Another thing that Shelley does, related to key romantic ideas, is that he describes in detail the nature and ramifications of romantic inspiration. If you really want to understand what romantics mean by inspiration, read Shelley. They all believe the same thing, but Shelley expresses it the best. That's that synthetic quality of his defense I was telling you about. Now, Shelley says, this is not original, but he says it well, the true poet should be like an Aeolian harp. What is an Aeolian harp? It is a small stringed instrument that produces natural music when the wind blows over its strings. Some of you have seen one of these Aeolian, or sometimes it's pronounced Aeolian, harp. It is a little box and it's got strings, and again, when the wind blows over it makes music. Sometimes there are little balls that hit the strings. Aeolos, or Aeolos, is the Greek god of wind, so that's where the name... Sometimes we just call it a wind harp. Now, what's the analogy here? The analogy is, in the same way that the wind blows over the strings and it makes music, in the same way, inspiration blows over the poet, causing him to create. Again, we have here that romantic privileging of sort of the feminine over the masculine. Again, in the same way that the wind blows over the harp, or inspiration blows over the poet, it's sort of the way a woman is sort of seduced by her lover. So again, it's a little bit more feminine. Now, although Shelley, like Wordsworth and Coleridge, does state that the poet modulates the wind of inspiration. In other words, the poet does add something and respond actively a little bit. Still, Shelley nevertheless presents the poet more as a passive recipient of imagination than as an active artisan. In other words, Shelley, and this tends to be romantic, privileges the passive over the active. Coleridge is a little bit unique when he emphasizes the secondary imagination more than the primary imagination. Shelley is very much in the romantic tradition of passivity as being the core of inspiration and creativity. Indeed, Shelley asserts that no poet can say, I will compose poetry today. Only when the unpredictable spirit of inspiration falls upon him can he really create. You have to wait for inspiration to fall upon you. You have to passively receive it. Now, this belief, however, as you might imagine, can cause much angst. For the problem is that inspiration leaves as fast as it comes. The poet, Shelley says, is like a fading coal that burns out even as it burns. And there's that romantic angst. They wait for inspiration. They wait to receive it passively. That's the source. And yet it comes, they're excited, and then it goes away like that fading coal. So that, again, causes an angst, wild. In fact, Shelley basically says that if we could only hold on to that burning fire of inspiration, we would be like gods. But alas, its departure is as mysterious as its arrival. Like trying to hold sand in a sieve, just runs through. Again, or water in a sieve, I really should say. It just runs right through. So again, that romantic angst has to do with this need for inspiration, but when it goes away, what do? You're left empty and drained. Still, while it lasts, inspiration transforms the poet into a poet-prophet. Like all the Romantics, Shelley exalts the poet as a sort of divine conduit. Now, Shelley did not really believe in a God in the Christian sense, but he believed, I guess, in supernatural or divine things, if you will. And the poet is a conduit of that. This, again, is another way of looking at Plato. Plato said that possession is bad. Romantics say it's good. It makes them like a prophet. The poet, Shelley says, and I like this phrase, transforms all that he perceives by bringing it into harmony with beauty and the good, with the eternal, the infinite, and the one. Again, the romantic poet seeks beauty and harmony everywhere, and if it's not there, he creates it. He wants to bring everything into sync with each other. And the romantic definition of beauty would be a kind of harmony, a higher kind of harmony. For Shelley, the poet is a prophet, and therefore, like a prophet, he rips away the twin veils of mystery and familiarity to reveal truth. Sort of what Wordsworth and Coleridge do, rip down the veil of familiarity and rip down the veil of mystery. Both of those have to come down. Romantic poetry is basically apocalyptic. Many people are confused about the meaning of this word. The last book of the Bible, we call it Revelation, but that's the Latin word. In the original Greek, it's apocalypsis. That's the name of the last book of the Bible. Both apocalypsis and revelation mean the same thing. They mean literally an uncovering. What is supposed to be happening in that last book of the Bible is that John, being inspired by God, is doing something apocalyptic because he's ripping away the veil and allowing us to see how history really works, what's really going on. Now, this might confuse you because you think, wait a minute, apocalyptic literature is always incredibly confusing. It doesn't uncover anything. Why is apocalyptic literature confusing? It's confusing because when the veil is ripped away and we see how things really work, well, we're not used to seeing how things really work, so we're confused. When we see what I like to call the ghosts in the machine that lie behind, we don't know how to interpret them because we're not used to seeing them. So apocalyptic almost means itself and its opposite, the way we sometimes use it. An uncovering, but also a mystifying. But again, it's only mystifying because we've uncovered something that we're not used to seeing. All right. Now, Shelley says that the poet-prophet does his prophecy in solitude, away from the city, away by himself. And yet, the funny thing is, although the poet-prophet is alone, he's not really alone, because each poet, Shelley says, contributes a stanza to the eternal poem that is still being written. I love this beautiful image. It's sort of like not only poetry as an organic whole, but all of poetry as an organic whole. Each poet is adding a stanza to the great poem that has been written since Homer right up to our day. Wonderful image. And, Shelley goes further, just as each poet-prophet is linked to this greater poem, so are all poets of a given age linked to a single, all-penetrating spirit. So it works on two levels. As a poet, I'm linked to all poetry, but I'm specifically linked to my age, to the spirit of my age that I am embodying in some way. Now, In his own day, Shelley felt so strongly the influence of this unifying spirit, this romantic spirit, that he called it the spirit of the age. And many of you know that in German the word is Zeitgeist. It means literally the spirit of the age. And Shelley, like many romantics, often speak of the spirit of the age. And Shelley saw himself and his fellow poets as a trumpet of this spirit. In other words, there's this zeitgeist running around. The role of the poet is to take it and express it. The mouthpiece, the trumpet that announces this spirit that's in society. Again, I think a wonderful image that is very prophetic. Now, what I've said so far is, again, not totally unique to Shelley. He's borrowing ideas from everywhere, just giving them a better synthesis. In the end of my lecture, though, I want to look at 3 things that I feel are fairly unique to Shelley. Something that is a little bit different than what's been said by other people. First of all, Shelley's defense is not, like Sidney's apology, merely an abstract apology. In a way, Sidney is just speaking in general. The defense is very, very specific, because Shelley wrote the defense in direct response to another essay called The 4 Ages of Poetry by Thomas Love Peacock. Now, this work, The 4 Ages of Poetry, is a satirical essay that argued that the growth and progress of society was slowly rendering poetry obsolete. He was saying, again, oh, we're a technological age. We really don't need poetry anymore. It's useless. It's obsolete. Now, you know what? Peacock was being very satirical. But Shelley didn't get it, okay? Shelley was very serious about poetry. It's not a laughing matter for him. And so he took it as a personal insult in a way. What do you mean poetry's useless? And so he wrote the defense to answer Peacock. Shelley counters the argument Peacock makes, even though it's satirical. He takes it serious. He counters it by arguing for the moral and social uses of poetry. Of course, by doing so, he's answering Plato as well. First, let's see how he defends the moral role of poetry. Now, according to Shelley, I love this phrase, the great instrument of moral good is the imagination. He believed that poetry, by awakening and enlarging the mind, both leaves us open and receptive to beauty and love, and enables us to move out of ourselves. There's an old medieval definition of love that says love is the movement out of narcissism, when we move out of ourselves. God showed love when he moved out of himself to create the world. He showed even more love when he literally moved out of himself to become a man in Jesus. So Shelley, again, he has a very Christian ethic of morality or love as moving, as empathy, as moving towards a person. And he believed poetry increases this ability that we have, and that makes us a better person, more moral person. Poetry, he says, sensitizes us to the needs of others. It allows us to put ourselves in their place and to see the world from their perspective. There is a link here with negative capability somewhat. The first definition of negative capability I gave you, of moving out of yourself, of empathy. Now, again, that sounds funny with Shelley, because Shelley was a great womanizer, but he kept moving out of himself, and I think he was really in love with all of them. He's kind of an interesting character, biographically speaking. Now, Shelley also argues, and I want you to know that he's being passionate and sincere. Now, this may sound silly, but very passionately and very sincerely, Shelley says that he cannot conceive what the moral state of our world would be had Dante, Shakespeare, and Milton never lived. They, he says, are our true moral teachers. He's not just doing hyperbole here. He means that. He really believes that it's the Pope. Now, he's not an anti-Bible or anything. He believes the Bible's important too. But he believes the Bible's poetry. So, I mean, what he's saying is that it's these people, it's these poets that have made us better people. That's the real morality. Poetry is a higher kind of philosophy. It is poetry, he says, that impels us to rise above base and selfish desires, that inspires in us virtue, love, patriotism, and friendship. Again, that's what makes us better people. Think about Longinus, how the sublime moves away from hedonism and materialism to something higher, more spiritual, more true. That's what Shelley says poetry does. So much for the moral defense of poetry. What about the useful? And this part, I think, is the most unique of all Shelley, and I've really borrowed this idea a lot in my writing. Shelley says that poetry is actually more useful and necessary in an age of progress and science and technology. Why? Here's his reason. He says that at present, We have more political knowledge, more philosophical ideas, more scientific facts and figures than we know what to do with. Basically, he's saying we've bitten off more than we can chew. We've got all these great ideas, but what can we do with them? Well, he says that discrete facts and ideas are of no real use to us or to society until we can arrange and conceive those facts in terms of higher laws and ideals. Let me give you a modern example. Everybody keeps saying this internet is great. It's going to make our kids so much smarter and so much wiser. Well, I'm not against the internet. I'm glad that they're getting information. But I do not think yet at this point that the internet is making our kids smarter, and I'll tell you why. The internet is just a bunch of discrete facts and figures. And for most kids, the internet is a big potpourri of Trivial Pursuit. All, this here, these ideas here, they surf from one website to another like people surf on the TV. And again, facts and figures are important. But if you don't synthesize them into something meaningful, you are not really intelligent. You are not wise, certainly, but you're not even knowledgeable. Again, that's what wisdom is, when we take our ideas and put them. That's why I believe computers don't think yet, because computers are data banks. When a computer starts synthesizing, maybe they'll think. We'll see if they can really do that someday. So, again, Shelley is saying that we need the creative faculty, the poetic imagination to synthesize this sea of discrete facts into something tangible, knowable, and human. And that's what poetry does. Kind of like Wordsworth, it humanizes our knowledge. It allows us to use it so that it means something to us and isn't just a bunch of facts strung together. All right, finally, the third thing that I say is unique to Shelley. Shelley says that it is the poets who are the greatest creators and innovators of society. Now, in this, he is following Sidney and others, but he takes it to new levels. Shelley asserts that poets are the originators of language, the inventors of the arts, the architects of law and religion. We've seen this idea before, but Shelley takes it to new heights. This idea that, again, poetry originates everything. And one way we can prove that, do you know what the real origin is of classical Greek society? Why the 5th century BC was so great? Because they all read their Homer. Homer was the school book. The way the Bible used to be the school book in our country, well, all those Greeks learned from Homer. And I think that's where the golden age came out of. The poets are our teachers. They're there. Remember again, Amphion, who builds the wall of Thebes using his pipe. But again, he goes even farther past Sidney. Shelley ascribes to poets an almost godlike status. They are an influence, he says, which is moved not, but moves. Many of you remember that Aristotle calls God the unmoved mover. Well, for Shelley, the poet is the unmoved mover. Here he is at the stable center, and he moves everything. His ideas are ever creative. According to Shelley, poets are an apocalyptic force, ever purging and renewing our words, our thoughts, our perceptions, and our dreams. Again, if it wasn't for poetry, our language would become stale, all cliches. Poets come along every century or so, or every half century, and baptize our language, if you want to put it that way. Purge it, renew it, make it fresh and alive. So without the poets, everything's dead. And you see, if our language gets dead and stale, our ideas and our thoughts and our words get dead and stale. Again, Shelley is not just being hyperbolic here. He's very, very serious. It is a river that ever is purifying. That's what poetry is. In fact, do you know what the last line is of the defense of poetry? It's famous. He says, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, Shelley does get carried away. By the end of his defense, poetry is everything that is great or good in the world. But again, he's very serious about this. And again, this is where we get the highest view of this divine poet. If you want to see the poet raised to the highest level he can possibly be, you want to read Shelley's defense of poetry. And again, he's serious and sincere, and that's what he aspired to be, a poet prophet. Although so often people didn't listen to him, and he got very upset when that happened.